Welcome to NDS. Today we're discussing, as part of our educational series on the YouTube channel, we're discussing fats and fatty acids and fatty acid profiles of forages and feeds and how they affect our diets and possibly milk fat depression. We're very fortunate today to have Dr. Kevin Harvatine, Associate Professor in Nutritional Physiology from Penn State University, who's been doing great research on fatty acids of feeds and in milk production. Kevin, I'll hand it off to you.
Great. Hello, thank you for having me. So just wanted to kind of give some background on how I think about fatty acids in a diet. When I'm evaluating a diet for fatty acids, I always want to start with the basal diet and then work up through our ingredients. So we start out with our forages and cereal grains that, even though they're low in fat, they make up a large part of our diet. So they bring in a considerable amount of fat. Next, start thinking about oil seeds and high fat byproducts that are smaller parts of our diet, but they're high in fat concentration and are bringing in a good number of grams of fat. On top of that, we may have some oils or tallow coming into the diet. And then the last thing is our dry fat supplements. Some people might call these rumen-N or protected, but these are fat supplements we're selecting to achieve different things in our diet based on fatty acid profile of those products. So the cereal grains and forages, like I said, they're low in fat, but they're such a large amount of the diet. They bring in a lot of fat. They are extensively rumen biohydrogenated, so this is the microbes are taking the unsaturated fatty acids in these and are biohydrogenating them, and if that goes to completion, they're ending up as saturated fat. And we can pretty safely account that over 90 or probably even more than 95% of the unsaturated fat in these forages and cereal grains are going to completion in that process. Our cereal grains, when we compare them, corn is going to be a little bit higher in fat than wheat and sorghum, but their fatty acid profiles are going to be pretty similar. When we're wilting forages, we end up losing some of that unsaturated fat because of sunlight and oxygen exposure. The rate of release of these fatty acids, which is really important to think about in our different sources, probably depends on the digestion rate. If we think about pastures that have really rapid digestibilities, unsaturated fat's also going to be really rapid and probably contributes to some of the milk fat depression that we see in that really lush pasture situation. If we look across our different feed ingredients, if just from the big view, our forages, so our grasses, alfalfa, and the forage part of our corn silage is high in 18-3. So this is omega-3 fatty acid, but these are going to be extensively biohydrogenated. Our corn and soybean products and also cottonseed is going to be high in 18-2. And then our animal fats, so lard or tallow, and our palm fats, like we would see in our traditional calcium salt products, are a blend of saturated and monounsaturated fat. So in general, 18-2 is thought of as the higher risk for milk fat depression. So it's hard to say exactly what that number is, but we probably consider then 18-2 fatty acid is maybe 2 to 3 times the risk for disturbing rumen fermentation and causing milk fat depression compared to 18-1 or 18-3. So we really have to watch out for these corn and soybean fatty acids. We used to be able to know what the fatty acid profile was without testing because fatty acid profiles within feed ingredients was pretty consistent. But now we have examples of where people have selected for different fatty acid profiles. Canola would be a really great example of this, that start out with rapeseed and they selected to be low in these 20 and 22 carbon fatty acids and high in oleic acid, and have made really major shifts in that fatty acid profile. More recently, we have soybeans that are high in 18-2, and to reduce the oxidation of this fat, and the fryers at Burger King and McDonald's, they've made a genetically modified soybean that's low in 18.2 and 18.3 and high in oleic acid. So this soybean is now widely available, and we expect that it reduces our risk for milk fat depression by decreasing 18.2 and increasing our 18.1 supply. Our oil seeds are high in triglycerides and these unsaturated fatty acids. Again, traditionally consistent fatty acid profile, but now we have to consider that. The big thing to realize is that processing has a really large impact on some of these oil seeds. In that processing has an effect on the rate of release of that fatty acid within the rumen. So just quickly, some data from a project looking at free oil versus feeding whole soybeans or roasted soybeans. And when they fed that free oil, they caused milk fat depression, dropping those cows from a 3.5 to a 2.75. But the same amount of fat coming from the whole seed didn't cause milk fat depression. Now that's sort of the extreme example of free oil versus it in the seed. But when we grind, we basically are putting ourselves somewhere between that whole seed and that free oil. So our recommendation is that for soybeans, if we go to halves and quarters, that is all we need to get the digestibility, the protein, and that maintains slow release of that fat within the rumen. We don't want to grind those too far, or we're going to cause more issues because that oil is more rapidly available in the rumen. Just quickly mention about our high-fat byproducts. So distiller grains is the one that we commonly see there. Our distiller grains fat concentrations decreased over time as they're recouping some of that oil out of the process. But the risk there is that oil is really rapidly available because it's actually been dumped back on the outside of that grain and is very rapidly available in the rumen. We'd also have some other byproducts out there, like baker byproducts, that can be higher in fat depending on the source. And you'd also want to consider the fatty acid profile of that. A lot of variation in availability there. Vegetable oils and soap stocks are ones that we might not see as commonly today. They're going to be higher in unsaturated fat. Where we need to be careful is about rancidity, because that oil, when we've extracted oil and exposed it to oxygen, it has much higher rate of oxidation. That's going to cause some off flavors to begin with, and then from there actually create some toxic byproducts. The rumen is able to chew up some of those and reduce that risk, but we want to make sure those oils have been handled in a good way. Our dry fat supplements are sort of the last thing to kind of put the icing on our cake when we're balancing fatty acid profile. If you're looking to bring in more unsaturated fatty acids, calcium salts are the way to do that. We're not protecting those fatty acids in the sense of getting them through to the duodenum, but the calcium salt slows the release of that fatty acid within the rumen and makes it a safer way to feed unsaturated fat. And then we have our prilled saturated fat supplements. They're going to differ in being palmitic or stearic, the amount of oleic that's in there that's probably helping with digestibility, and then also if they're free fatty acids versus the triglycerides. So big decision between unsaturated and saturated fat, and then between palmitic and stearic within our saturated fats. And within our unsaturated fats, the question of 18.2 or omega-6 versus 18.3, and then our long chain omega-3s coming from fish oil type supplements. Unsaturated fatty acids are a big risk for milk fat depression. We want to consider the amount of unsaturated fatty acids. So looking at fatty acid concentration and profile. Again, 18.2 is more important than 18.1 and 18.3. Grains and oil seeds are generally high in that 18.2, forages high in 18.3. And the rate of availability also needs to be considered. The big comparison I always like to use there is cottonseed versus distiller grains. So cottonseed has more fat than distiller grains, about the same fatty acid profile, but we hardly ever see milk fat depression caused by cottonseed, but it's very common to see milk fat issues when we start feeding higher levels of distiller grains. And this really comes down to a rate of availability that in whole cottonseed, that fatty acid is not protected in the rumen. It's not leaving the rumen and being absorbed in the duodenum, but it is such a slow release in the rumen that it's not overwhelming the rumen microbes. We did a project looking at fatty acid profile in corn silage because we had kind of observed over time that high corn silage diets were higher risk for milk fat depression. So the first thing we did is we looked at where the unsaturated fatty acids were in corn. And we found that over 90% of our 18.1 and 18.2 fat was found in the kernel. And we know from other work that most of that 18.2 in the kernel would actually be within the germ. The leaves were high in 18.1. And we want to know what the effective corn hybrid was. And when you look at the literature, there's a reasonable amount of literature, not nearly as deep as soybeans and some other oil seeds. But basically, we know that the effect is mostly genetic. There's a very small effect of environment. This would be in contrast to fiber digestibility that's really highly driven by growing conditions. In the genetics, there's a large variation between some of the published data where we have corn varieties from across the world. But we wanted to know what was available in our commercial hybrids. So we had samples from corn silage and Pennsylvania test plots in 2 years, and then also corn silage plots out of South Dakota State University. And if we look at our fatty acid profile, we see a reasonable amount of variation in fatty acid profile. This is just specifically looking at 18.2 concentration. So we have in our Pennsylvania plots going from around 45 to just over 50% 18.2 in that corn silage. Now, what's really the better way to look at this is as percent of dry matter. So we have in the middle corn silage fatty acid, and then total fatty acids, and then 18.2 is a percent of fatty acids. If we look across these 2 years, we're looking at a 0.4 to 0.5 unit difference in 18.2 when we go from our 10th to 90th percentile. So for 18.2. So this isn't, I always like to say this isn't going to solve every one of your problems, but this is about the difference in 18.2 that I balance in my diets when I'm trying to set up a low to a moderate risk of milk fat depression. Part of this is coming from that difference in fatty acid profile. Part of this is coming from a difference in fat concentration. If we look at what's the impact of this on our rueful load, it depends on the amount of corn silage that we're feeding. So if we go from that 10th to a 90th percentile, that 0.9 to 1.6% of dry matter, and then if we're feeding 30 to 54% corn silage on a dry matter basis in our diet, that's a 60 to 90 gram difference in 18.2 intake just in corn silage. Now, on top of that, we have to think about what's the rate of availability within that corn silage. We don't really have exact numbers on that, but I think that if you're doing a really good job processing that corn, remember all of that 18.2 is within the germ, and we're probably making that 18.2 quite rapidly available in processing. So what can you do? My recommendation is to test your corn silage. So each crop year and when you have milk fat depression. So basically what you want to know is where am I on this continuum? If you have higher fat in your corn silage, you probably want to be careful about bringing in distiller grains and other rumen available 18.2 sources. If you're on the low side, you know you can take advantage of some of those other feed ingredients. Very little difference between fresh and fermented feed. We have NIR equations that are available and work well. What we have to be careful is that there seems to be some variation between the labs. So you'd want to either account for that when you're looking between the labs or stick within one lab. Some of this may be due to that drying method that's being used within the lab. Long run, I hope we can select for low 18.2 and high 18.1 corn silage, but that's a longer term goal that the corn genetics companies are going to have to help us with. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of background on important aspects to fatty acid profile. I think now we can jump into NDS.
Thanks, Kevin. I really appreciate that. I think it got me to thinking as this information came out a couple of years ago. I wasn't very sensitive to it. So I just kind of wanted to review. I've got a ton of questions for you, but we'll address those some other time offline. But the interesting aspect is looking at NDS and looking at a couple diets that I brought up. I just brought up a diet and looked at the screen, and this is the old fatty acid page here that has been around the model for quite a while under CNCPS. And here is the intake numbers. Looking at that, here's the total intake in grams. The RUM&N team put the RUFL number here and also put the omega-6, omega-3 ratio here. We want to look at that. The thing that got me real sensitive to looking at that is we can look at the total intake here and then go into feed details and pool size, and then I can actually look at the ingredient contribution into either my 18.2 intake, which is similar to the other screen. It's just showing me that now my corn silages, and I have 2 of them in this ration. We're basically blending these 2 to get through, but it's a large contribution to where I am. And then the other question I have, and we can discuss this later, but flaked corn versus ground corn, and like you said, the rate there. We also have a calcium salt in here in this ration here. We can look at that intake, and then the RUM&N team also does have lipolysis and duodenal, and we need to get a little more sensitive to those numbers. But comparing the intake here in the 18.2 area of about 300 grams, but if I come back to another diet that we may be looking at where our intake number is quite high, and if I go back to looking at feed details here, pool size again, same screen, I can see that 18.2 contribution is similar, and come down through and look at cotton and flakes. And I've got 2 different, here's the flakes and here's the corn. And again, it may not be amount, it may be more rates. The thing that we did discuss and we were talking about is looking at the contribution from a corn silage. So just opening that corn silage and going to constant calculations and fatty acids. This, after hearing some of the information you shared at Florida, got me really intrigued on the total fatty acid and the amount of 18.2 showing up in some of these samples. So it really got me thinking about that contribution of these corn silages versus a corn silage from another farm that might have quite a bit different analysis coming through as far as a 18.2 contribution in total fatty acid. So it's something I think many of us have overlooked, and yet looking at the contribution of this 18.2 in there has really made me understand how we really need to be sensitive to that. And reviewing a lot of my diets, I think I was back at maybe 40% of my dry matter intake coming from corn silage, but I've seen a lot of diets, and Kurt and I saw several of them as we reviewed diets with people that are pushing, 50% of intake when their forage inventories were really a struggle when we were looking at some of those diets from last forage harvest and using as much corn silage or what was available. So just wanted to review some of that and look at where those numbers are and become more sensitive to that. I really appreciate your time and sharing with us the information that you did. Hopefully, we can make better informed decisions and use the tools we have. So with that, I just wanted to wrap up and say thank you for your time. Thanks for the information, and hopefully we can do a better job on our dairies looking at feeds and butterfat. So thanks, Kevin.
Thank you for having me.